So the US trade chief, Catherine Tai, she's raised concerns with India over the government's new order. This order mandates licenses for the import of laptops and tablets and personal computers. Now, Tai's intervention comes amidst these worries about this licensing regime, how it could impact shipments from the likes of Apple and Dell and force firms to boost local manufacturing in India. But what is India's argument? India's argument is that these new norms, which are due to come into effect on the 1st of November, they're aiming to ensure that only trusted hardware and systems enter India. And India is also seeking to reduce dependence on imports, boost local manufacturing, in part address the country's trade imbalance with China too. So while India and the US continue to engage to find a solution to this only bilateral dispute that stands between the two nations now at the World Trade Organization, because the others have been negotiated, the question rises on the kind of implications this has, both domestically and globally, for the kind of curbs that India is putting on these imports. Here's a report on this before we delve into this debate discussion tonight.
Right, so United States Trade Representative Catherine Tai, who was in India last week, raised concerns over new import licensing norms that were announced by DGFT just a couple of weeks back. In fact, concerns were raised amidst worries that she said are related to shipments. In fact, she also stated that there were stakeholders that needed an opportunity to review and provide input to ensure that the policy, if implemented, does not have an adverse impact on US exports to India. In fact, Tai and Minister Goel both agreed to explore this issue further and find a solution that addresses the concerns of both the countries. Remember, this comes after at least 8 trade bodies representing global tech brands wrote to the US Department of Commerce to push India to reconsider implementing these import restrictions on IT hardware that includes laptops and PCs, also stating that the measure could lead to delays and uncertainties and could severely affect the smooth functioning of supply chains. In fact, one of the bodies even held a meeting with officials from the Prime Minister's office last week, requesting for concessions for companies that have committed to invest in PLI till a proper manufacturing base comes up. Remember, this is something that we told you first at ET Now last week. Now, with all of these bodies stating that the decision was implemented without prior notice, but government sources also told us last week that talks with brands happened well before this notification was announced. These new licensing norms will come into effect on November 1st and are an attempt by the Indian government to reduce the country's dependence on imports and boost local manufacturing.
Well, that lays in context exactly what we are up against. As far as the debate goes, let's bring in our guest. R. Chandrasekhar is, of course, the former president of NASSCOM and the former IT secretary. Along with him, Ajay Dua is here, the former secretary for the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, along with Arpita Mukherjee, professor at ICRIER, which is the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. Great to have you all with us. But let me come to you first, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Tell us how valid you think are these American concerns about India's policy for licenses to import laptops and personal computers and tablets. You know, because a broad coalition of America's largest businesses, from Apple to Intel, they've been protesting the abrupt way, they call it, in which India has introduced these tech import restrictions. And their message is clear that only the assurance of predictable regulatory climate can make trade between India and the US reach its potential. How valid are these American concerns that the US trade rep has raised at the G20, a fear that India is slipping back perhaps into license raj? Do you think that's a reasonable concern?
The US has expressed its concerns, and that's fine from their point of view. But from an India perspective, I think obviously India would have to look at its own concerns. And there are plenty of them, primarily, the over-dependence on imports from China, which has both economic and security implications, and how to deal with that. Now, how to deal with that is a question. Is this the right instrument is another question. But it is, reasonably clear that something needed to be done for the simple reason that India cannot in perpetuity rely, especially given its presence in the IT sector, we cannot perpetually rely on imports for IT and telecom equipment and for all the components thereof. So there are undoubtedly security aspects to this as well. So the question is not whether India should have done something, done this or done something or not. The question is whether this was the right instrument, whether this is too blunt an instrument, because it's noteworthy that while the concerns with regard to China are well known and are prime motivation, you know, the concerns have come from the US, which was not the, the main target, and
Yes.
which was not one of the non-trusted sources.
Yes.
Similarly, you know, the fact that even NASSCOM, which is India's, IT industry body, has also expressed its concern. So the fact that people who were, and organizations, industry, local industry, and, you know, businesses which were not the target have raised concerns would tend to indicate that perhaps this is too blunt an instrument.
Right. So you're saying that this is an instrument that needed to come in, but not perhaps this specific way of dealing with the problem. As far as dependence on China is concerned, we needed to reduce that, and there is that need as well, something that the US has articulated, and perhaps we are acting to that extent on that advice as well. But from India's perspective, Mr. Dua, do weigh in on this.
How instrument in short.
Sorry?
We need a sharper instrument.
A
not
sharper
very blunt
instrument, something
That's-
stronger than this.
Yes. No, by sharper, I mean more focused.
I see.
You know, this is a blunt instrument, so it is having a lot of impact, including in areas where perhaps you did not intend it to have that much of an impact. The Indian
Right.
IT industry, for example, or
Right.
the US, for example.
So you are saying that we needed to
That's
address
right.
the security concerns with China more directly, rather than have something that was so broad-based, in a sense.
Yes.
Can I come in now?
That
Yes,
technique
Mr.
is
Dua,
another
please
thing.
go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I think the question of self-sufficiency being achieved at the earliest remains our biggest concern, and rightly so, considering that this is one sector in which we have comparative advantage, and we could build up a base as we have done, a manufacturing base, as we are doing in the case of mobile telephones, got stronger base, more exports. But here it's a question of more than exports in the first instance. Our imports are rising drastically, and we needed to check that. And as just pointed out by Mr. Chandrasekhar, the question of addressing the concern with China probably was the uppermost. Moving on, I would say that the government has handled it reasonably well, but not perfectly. I say this, one, because it looked like a knee-jerk reaction when the deadline was extended by 3 months from 1st of August to 1st of November.
Yes.
Second, if licensing is all that we are doing, which, however, as we know from our past experience, that can be discretionary, can be time-consuming. The instruments which are other instruments
And doesn't
which
it
are
send out the wrong message as well, Mr. Dua?
Yes, that is where I am coming to the question that the barriers to trade or restrictions could come about through other means, as was alluded to, and I would refer to the import duty aspect.
Right.
We have already gradually raised the import duty on finished products to 20%.
Right.
That wasn't adequate. That should have been revisited rather than bringing in moving it from what's called OGL, Open General License, to a licensing regime, because that comes with all its disadvantages as well as uncertainty,
Yes.
which has been referred to by USTR,
Yes.
and as well as lies in the minds of organizations like
Arpita
NASSCOM.
Mukherjee, what do you think? As far as India's move is concerned, How much of a problem area is this landing us in when it comes to the World Trade Organization?
See, the World Trade Organization dispute mechanisms is not working very well, and it when you put a national security reason, it takes some time to swallow it. Like my previous speakers have already mentioned that. There are data breach issues. There are three areas which can be questioned, and it is controversial. First is on the what basis the exemptions are given, because if somebody wants to breach a data, it can be through re-export, repairs, and all the other. How do you decide the 20 computers that is coming in for research? So the exemptions do not show that the security concerns related to the licensing and the exemptions are really not matching. On what basis? Now, when you talk about trusted partners, are these trusted brands, trusted importers? So there are trusted manufacturers. So there are many players engaged in the supply chain of the laptop. And how do you define trusted? That is again has not been explained. So in my opinion, when such a policy national security, which can be challenged in the WTO, it is always good to do a bit of a homework before that and put it down. Who are the trusted partners? How do you determine them? Who are the trusted importers? How did you judge them? Nowadays, there is also, since every import is online, you will be able to easily dig out a list of importers. And you know exactly who they are, and you have their other details, like whether they have paid their GST on time, whether they are registered, whether they have any criminal offense. So it is not very difficult to use technology to determine trusted, but that definition has to be clear.
So all three of you are talking about the security aspect, the need propelled by the security aspect, especially when you're talking about imports from China. But Mr. Chandrasekhar, recently, of course, India has extended the Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, the PLI, to several sectors. Now, IT hardware falls under that ambit. How ready is our manufacturing to take on this increased demand when this policy actually kicks in on the 1st of November? Is there enough time to move from contract manufacturing, you're saying, to a larger Make in India kind of scenario? Because most of these international brands would need at least a year to set up all their factories, isn't it?
Yes, I think that has various aspects to be considered. First and foremost, how do you deal with this problem? There are certain positive actions which you can take, like PLI, investment incentives, infrastructure incentives, and so on, which have been in place for quite some time. It's not something which hasn't been there. It's been there for well over, I think, at least a couple of years. But that has not produced the desired results. The other is that you can take negative steps also, like, for example, imposing an import duty. But in the case of laptops, IT and telecom sectors, the problem is that, because of the ITA 1 and ITA 4, the instrument of using duties, customs duties, to provide a modicum of protection for domestic manufacture and thereby level the playing field is not available. So that is the other constraint. So let me elaborate a little bit on what I meant by a sharper instrument and a more focused instrument. And I think this was brought out when the lady from ICRIER was talking about the need to define the security requirements. Now, we know that the whole of the laptop is not sensitive from a security point of view. For example, the case is not important, the screen is not important. Plus, the fact is that, the global supply chains are involved in this. They are all widely dispersed. No country, China included, has a value addition of more than 40 to 50%. Even that is very high. And therefore, we have to be very explicit in what we are focused on. For example, the chip, the semiconductor, the design.
Yes.
These are the kind of areas where we need to define. We need to have a runway which is sufficient after discussing with industry, saying this is going to come in. Now you tell us how much time you need to do this, how much time you need to be able to certify that these components are either made in India
Right.
or coming from certain trusted sources. So I think that's the way to get a more focused.
So you're saying that not enough engagement has
yes.
happened with the industry. You did say a knee-jerk reaction. Mr. Dua, was more work required by the government to be able to deploy a strategy that would actually work for the industry and work for the Make in India credo as well?
Absolutely right. What I'm alluding to is that there is need for an industrial policy, long-term perspective for each important sector of the economy, in the manufacturing, assembly, and all kinds of other manufacturing processes. But if we suddenly react to a fact, and in this particular case, as we would recall, the response to the PLI scheme till July, which was the deadline, wasn't very good. The government had to extend it by a month to August, and along with that, they also kind of tried to make it more attractive by giving protection by way of licensing. I would have thought that, yes, licensing can be a methodology compared to other options, but let these be part of an integrated policy, not thought as a mere reaction or a response to a phenomena affecting the industry.
Arpita Mukherjee, by way of the choice of IT hardware as a means to kind of perhaps send a message or create a kind of strategy to be able to counterbalance what China brings to the table, the kind of trade imbalance that we have with China, all those issues, trying to address them in this particular industry. Tell us what this says about the choice that the government has made in terms of putting this slam dunk in the center of manufacturing and making sure that local manufacturing is right now concentrated on IT hardware.
See, basically, if you go to the IT hardware manufacturing and why it did not take up, when the initial SEZ scheme came in, a number of IT companies, manufacturing companies were looking at India, and some also established their presence. I'm talking 10 years ago. But if they were selling it to the domestic tariff area, which is outside the SEZ or across SEZ, for example, if a Tata or a Infosys SEZ was buying a IT hardware from Dell, both in Tamil Nadu, it was a havoc for them because customs never recognized it, and they thought that, coming into the domestic tariff area, they were facing the unilateral or autonomous tariff, which was very high, whereas they could import it from Thailand at a zero duty with the Thai FTA. So what was the real problem? If you were manufacturing in an Indian SEZ at that point in time, your tariff to the domestic, you are selling it to the domestic tariff area at a higher tariff than what the FTA partners were getting when they had a FTA with India. So this was a big issue, and this came out during our SEZ study with the Ministry of Commerce. The other issue that came up with the study was the entire SEZ policy could be in the future challenged in the WTO. And when it got challenged in the WTO, we actually lost the case against the US in 2019. Since then, the SEZ and the electronic park policy has never been revived.
Correct.
Now, this is the biggest problem. The third problem is that if PLI is also a WTO actionable subsidy. Now, China has been very smart. It is giving subsidies, which is a gray area in the WTO. There are certain gray areas, and there you can happily subsidize, and even US firms are going to take those subsidies. But if you give subsidy in an area which is likely to be counterfeit,
yes,
very few foreign investors actually invest. Indian investors, they do not look at the WTO that much.
That's true. So, Mr. Chandrasekhar, if this is seen as a potential trade barrier, clearly the fear is that the shipments of US-made computers and electronics into India would get restricted, they would get obstructed, and this in turn could complicate the ability of businesses in the country to run and expand the operation. So Is that an exaggerated scenario, or does it seem real as of now? What are the immediate problems that you see now that 1st of November is not too far away and we'll have the restrictions come into play?
Well, if we just sort of step aside from the US concerns and look at the India concerns and take lessons from how other countries are dealing with this, because even the US does have these concerns. They have brought in certain technology restrictions on the transfer of sensitive and critical technologies. They have brought in the US Chips and Science Act recently. But most importantly, if we look at it from our own perspective, we have to recognize that this is a high volume, high velocity, low margin business where the scale is important. And unless we are at a global level in terms of cost effectiveness, in terms of quality, we will end up hurting ourselves more. So clearly, that's not the intention. That's not the idea. So without, eroding that part of it, I think we have to step carefully to make sure that we don't end up closing our domestic market in a way that leads to the sort of pre-liberalization era of, inferior quality goods. That will hurt us much more. So I think recognizing that these are global value chains, recognizing that we cannot be 100% self-reliant, recognizing that we have security concerns, we have to have a more graded path, proper glide path into how we get into the new equilibrium and take investors along, especially from countries and companies which are more trusted partners, and say, look, we want you to do this, and this is coming. So you have to tell us in what way this can be done. And if it can be done in a way where your objectives and our objectives are met, fine. But if not, you will have to live with it. And I'm sure that that can lead to a solution which is actually implementable and where the timelines are also more realistic.
Right.
Lastly, licensing, in whatever way it is brought in, I think has certainly added to the friction of business. And for a high volume, high velocity, low margin business, any friction, whether it is at the ports or with the customs or with the octroi or wherever, is absolutely deadly. So
right.
We have to, I think, keep all of these characteristics of the global electronic industry in mind,
yes.
and our concerns, and to find a way to bridge them. And
right.
as I said, there are ways, there
yes.
are things we can do.
Yes, you did mention. Mr. Dua, let you have the last word. What are the challenges that you see now that we are going on this path? There are risks involved in going down this route. And like Mr. Chandrasekhar is pointing out, the risks are quite obvious that we'll be perceived very differently. Our growth path is not being clear. And now if we put trade barriers like this, we are perhaps being self-defeating in a sense. Would you agree with that? And what's the way ahead according to you?
I would like to see the government getting involved with all the stakeholders in the next 2 months that's available to it before it comes out with an integrated policy on how to be handling this particular aspect. See, it is a much computers, laptops, PCs, and other similar devices on which such restrictions are being put are now an essential part of not just R&D or education, but working life everywhere in the world, and much more in a country like India, where we are taking to it fairly quickly, the digital aspect of it. So along with that, we would need to also consult with all the important players in the supply chain. You might say you have restricted the imports of end products, but if you are not able to access the critical parts of the supply chain, as was mentioned, chips, semiconductors, and other critical aspects, then you are not going to be able to go ahead with your assembly or manufacturing in India,
right.
because those parts,
yes, the basic parts are not available. Yes,
yes,
absolutely.
That restrictions can be put by
right.
other exporters, and that includes, let's just recall, that includes not just China,
yes.
but United States, Japan, Korea, Taiwan.
That's true.
These are the other 4 players who are all in this business, and we are a very small player as of now in making semiconductors, chips. So
Yes.
we have to go through the whole gamut of consultations, come to a consensus, make it certain what kind of restrictions we are going to put.
That's right. What you're saying is that we don't need knee-jerk reactions, and all our guests seem unanimous in their reaction to what the government is doing, that a reaction was required to the kind of scenario that we have, but perhaps it needs to be more graded and industry needs to be taken into confidence before a rollout of this nature, because otherwise we risk sending out the wrong message at a time that we are trying to build the entire manufacturing base of Make in India. Mr. Chandrasekhar, Mr. Dua and Arpita Mukherjee, many thanks for joining us with your perspective on this edition of India Tonight. We'll continue to track developments on this. But of course, the action continues on ET Now. I'm Vikram Oza from me and the team. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.